Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into a topic that might seem like a dusty history lesson, but trust me, it's got some surprisingly relevant connections to today: eugenics. We've got stacks of historical research, personal notes, and even a couple of YouTube videos to unpack. A real mix. So let's trace eugenics from its 19th century beginnings to its modern implications, shall we?
It really is amazing how an idea from over a century ago can still be relevant. And it all started with a guy named Francis Galton, who was absolutely captivated by his cousin Charles Darwin's theory of evolution.
Oh, right. Darwin publishes On the Origin of Species in 1859. And Galton's like, boom, what if we apply natural selection to humans? And eugenics is born.
But Galton didn't just theorize, he wanted to put these ideas into practice. Like, he coined the term eugenics in 1883 and was obsessed with this idea of studying something he called eminence.
Eminence sounds so, I don't know, impressive. Yeah. But what did Galton actually consider eminent? Was it just about brains and achievements, or was there something else going on?
That's a great question, and that's where it gets really interesting. Galton thought eminence was hereditary, and he spent years collecting data on families, trying to prove his point. He even wrote a book with a whole chapter on eminent wrestlers of the North Country.
Wrestlers. Okay, now I'm really curious. So maybe physical prowess was part of his definition of eminence too, not just brains, but like this ideal human potential.
Exactly. And that shows how eugenics, from the very start, was mixed up with social and cultural values. Galton's ideas about desirable traits were totally shaped by his time and his social class.
Okay, so we had this controversial idea in England. How does it cross the Atlantic and take root in America?
Well, think about the U.S. in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Rapid industrialization, tons of immigration, lots of social anxiety. And those in power, well, they were looking for ways to control those changes. And eugenics, it seemed to offer, well, a solution, to some people anyway.
It's almost like eugenics became a way to address the fears of that time.
Exactly. And you got to remember, the science of genetics was in its baby steps then. People were trying to make sense of these new ideas about heredity, but they didn't have the full picture. And it was easy to twist that incomplete understanding to fit their own biases.
So flawed science plus social anxieties equals, well, not a great outcome.
Sadly, you're right. The eugenics movement took off in the U.S., pushed by figures like Charles Davenport and Madison Grant. They were influential guys writing books, giving lectures, promoting this idea of improving society through selective breeding.
And this is a fact that just sends shivers down my spine. Major foundations, Carnegie and Rockefeller, they actually funded eugenics research. It's crazy to think that institutions we see as good could be involved in something so harmful.
It reminds us that good intentions don't always mean good outcomes, especially when they're based on, well, bad science and prejudiced assumptions. But the U.S. didn't just fund research, they put these ideas into practice in a way that had consequences, lasting consequences.
Okay, let's talk about that, the dark side of eugenics in action.
One of the most disturbing things was the rise of forced sterilization in the U.S. states started making laws that allowed them to forcibly sterilize people they considered unfit to have kids, and they often targeted those in marginalized communities and people with disabilities.
It's hard to believe that in a country that's all about individual freedom, something like that could happen.
And it wasn't just a few isolated cases either. The Supreme Court, in a case called Buck v. Bell, back in 1927, they actually upheld the constitutionality of these forced sterilization laws.
Buck v. Bell, that name is just, it's chilling, really.
It really is. The case was about Carrie Buck, this young woman labeled feeble-minded and institutionalized. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., the one who wrote the majority opinion, he said something that stayed with us. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That statement, it shows the flawed logic of the eugenics movement.
And Buck v. Bell, it had a huge impact, right? How many people were affected by these laws?
Over 65,000 people were sterilized in 33 states because of these laws. Think about that. Over 65,000 people denied their reproductive rights, often without their consent, or even understanding what was being done to them.
It's a really dark legacy that we're still dealing with today. And it's even more disturbing when you consider how the justifications for eugenics changed over time.
Yeah.
Like they revealed these underlying social biases that were always there.
You're right. In the beginning, it was all about preventing what they called race deterioration. They were scared that certain racial and ethnic groups were having more kids than white Americans, which they thought would lead to a decline in the nation's genetic stock.
So racism was a part of the eugenics movement from the very beginning.
Yeah, unfortunately it was. And then these arguments shifted to focus on economics and social welfare. They claimed that sterilizing people deemed unfit would save taxpayers money by reducing the number of people who might need public assistance.
So it was a way to justify cutting social programs and marginalizing vulnerable populations.
Exactly. And here's another twist. Some feminists back then actually supported eugenics. They thought it could give women more control over their reproductive choices.
It's a reminder that even movements with good intentions can get caught up in harmful ideologies. It's definitely a complex and uncomfortable truth. But before we get into how eugenics shows up today, let's take a minute to think about how these ideas became so widely accepted. How did eugenics go from a fringe theory to something embraced by scientists, politicians, and even everyday people?
Well, one thing was the rise of what they called social Darwinism. This idea, it was popularized by Herbert Spencer, took Darwin's theory of natural selection and applied it to human society. It basically said that the wealthy and successful were naturally fitter than the poor or marginalized.
So it was a way to justify the social hierarchy that already existed.
Precisely. Social Darwinism gave them a seemingly scientific basis for saying that some groups were just naturally better than others. It fit perfectly with the prejudices of the time.
And that idea of scientific legitimacy was really important for the eugenics movement, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. Eugenicists, they wanted to be seen as objective scientists, using statistics and genetic studies to support their claims. They even created places like the Eugenics Record Office, which collected data on family histories and traits, trying to prove that everything from intelligence to criminality was inherited.
It's like they were building a whole system to categorize people based on their supposed genetic worth.
That's exactly what they were doing. And this idea of categorization played right into the fears people had about immigration. The U.S. was seeing a lot of immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and a lot of eugenicists were worried about the impact of these newcomers on the nation's genetic makeup.
So immigration became a target for these eugenic policies.
Absolutely. Eugenicists pushed for stricter immigration laws, saying that some groups, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, were genetically inferior and would weaken the American population.
It's just crazy how these ideas, which we now know are totally wrong and harmful, were able to become so accepted. It makes you think about how seemingly rational people could believe such things.
It's important to remember that eugenics was often presented as something progressive, even humanitarian. Supporters truly believed they were working towards a better future for everyone.
They saw themselves as the good guys.
Yeah, in a really messed up way, they did. They thought that by controlling who could have kids, they could get rid of social problems and create a more fit and prosperous society. It's a huge warning about what can happen when you mix good intentions with bad science and deep-seated prejudice.
A cautionary tale, for sure. But the story of eugenics doesn't end there. Its shadow extends into the present day, raising a whole new set of ethical problems as we figure out these advances in genetic technology.
You're absolutely right. And that's where our deep dive takes us next, into the world of what some call new eugenics.
So get ready to explore how this desire to control reproduction, even though it might look different, hasn't actually gone away. It's taken on new forms in the 21st century. And that raises some really tough questions about what it means to shape the future of humanity.
It's wild, you know? Forced sterilization might seem like, well, something from a dark past, but this desire to control reproduction, it hasn't gone anywhere. Today, it's like it's morphed into something new, driven by, well, all these advances in genetic technology. And it's not about the government forcing anything anymore. It's about individual choices.
That's what's so fascinating about this new eugenics. It's all about personal freedom and choice. No more forced sterilization, but like parents potentially choosing what traits they want or don't want in their kids.
Exactly. Prenatal screening, genetic testing, all that allows parents to find out about potential health conditions in, a developing fetus, which can be amazing so parents can make informed decisions. But, well, there are some tough ethical questions that come with it.
Yeah, for sure. What happens if parents feel pressure to, I don't know, abort a fetus because it might have a genetic predisposition for something? Does that play into this whole designer baby idea?
That's one of the big worries, and it really gets at what we value as a society.
Yeah.
Are we moving towards a world where only certain types of lives are seen as, well, worthy? We're also seeing this rise of something called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD for short.
Okay, hold on. Break that down for me. What exactly is PGD?
So it's used along with IVF, in vitro fertilization, and it lets doctors screen embryos for certain genetic conditions before they're implanted. So like Theoretically, parents could choose an embryo that's less likely to, I don't know, develop certain diseases.
That's like, whoa, something straight out of a sci-fi movie. Designer babies, genetic perfection. Is that really where we're headed?
It's a huge question and we need to face it. Preventing serious diseases is a good goal, no doubt. But with this technology, well, we also have to ask, like, what do we even consider a disease?
Hmm.
And what happens to those embryos that don't fit the desired criteria?
It's like we're on this tightrope. On one side, the chance to, like, lessen suffering and improve health. But on the other, well, we have to be super careful not to create a world where only certain people are considered, I don't know, fit to exist.
You're right on the money there. And these technologies, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by our values, our biases, and that means there's a real risk of, well, further marginalizing and discriminating against folks with disabilities.
Right. And it's not just about discrimination down the line. What about right now? Could genetic testing be used to deny someone a job or health insurance? Could prenatal screening be used to, like, reinforce these negative stereotypes about disability?
Those are really important questions. We need to be open and honest about these ethical issues. We've got to make sure these powerful tools are used responsibly and fairly.
Absolutely. And that conversation needs to include the voices of people with disabilities, right? They're the ones who are most impacted by this. They have so much to offer, so many important perspectives.
We have to listen to them, to their experiences. Otherwise, we're just going to repeat the mistakes of the past. Using technology to, like, enforce these narrow definitions of what a good life should be.
We've gone through a lot in this deep dive, from, the beginnings of eugenics to how it shows up today. It's definitely not just a history lesson. This stuff is very much alive and kicking.
You said it, and it's something we need to pay attention to, be informed about, engage with it, ask the tough questions as we navigate this new world of genetic technology. What kind of future do we actually want?
Exactly. What really stands out to you in all this? What's, like, the most important takeaway?
For me, it's that eugenics wasn't just some weird blip in history. It was a symptom of these deep anxieties about race, class, control. And those anxieties, they haven't vanished. They're still here, shaping how we think about disability, difference, even the value of human life.
It's like eugenics was, I don't know, this symptom of a bigger problem in society. And the tools we have now, they can make that problem worse if we're not super careful.
Yeah, I think you're right. The challenge now is to recognize those symptoms as they show up today and find ways to deal with that underlying problem.
Mm.
We got to build a world that's more just, more fair, where everyone feels valued, respected, no matter their genes or abilities.
That's definitely something worth fighting for. And I think it starts with all of us asking ourselves some tough questions, like what's truly important in a human life? What makes a life good? And how can we make sure that these technologies help everyone thrive and don't just make inequality worse? This whole idea of a good life, in the context of eugenics, it's been really interesting to unpack. Seems simple on the surface, but the more we dig in, the more complicated it gets.
Oh, absolutely. It makes you think about your own values, like how do we define a good life? Is it
Yeah.
about health, happiness, achievements, or something totally different? And who gets to make that call?
Right. And in the past, like, those decisions were made for people
Yeah.
based on bad science and prejudice. Forced sterilization, for example. They thought they could prevent people they considered unfit from having children. It's just, I don't know, it's horrifying that something so wrong could be seen as okay.
It really shows what can happen when we let fear and prejudice, shape our policies. And even now, with all this genetic technology, we're still wrestling with these questions. What is a good life? And who decides?
It's like we've gone from this, state-imposed control to a more subtle kind of pressure. This pressure to fit in with what society says is normal or desirable for a child.
Exactly. Prenatal screening, PGD. Parents have so many choices now. They can find out about potential health issues, even choose embryos based on certain traits.
On the one hand, it's great to have that information to make informed decisions. But on the other hand, it brings up this idea of, like, a new eugenics, one that's driven by individual choices, not the government.
And that's where it gets really complicated. We want people to have freedom to make their own choices about reproduction, but we also have to make sure these technologies are used ethically, that they don't end up hurting or discriminating against certain groups.
So how do we find that balance? How do we use this technology for good without repeating the mistakes of the past?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I don't think there's an easy answer. It's going to take a lot of talking, a lot of thinking, and being willing to question our own assumptions.
Education seems really important, right? both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Absolutely. People need to understand what these technologies can do, the good and the bad. They need to know about the potential for bias, for discrimination. They need the tools to make choices that fit their own values.
And it's bigger than just individual choices too, right? We have to think about the whole picture, the social and ethical impact. How do we prevent these technologies from making inequality worse? How do we make sure that everyone, no matter their genes, has the chance to live a fulfilling life?
Those are the big questions, the ones we need to be asking ourselves. And the answers won't come just from scientists or politicians. It's going to take everyone, people from all walks of life, coming together to talk about this.
It's like we're all writing the next chapter in the human story,
Hmm.
you know? And this time, we have a chance to get it right, to use technology to help everyone thrive, not to limit or define who we are.
I like that, a new chapter. And as we write it, we can't forget the lessons we've learned. Eugenics, in all its forms, it teaches us what happens when we try to control or perfect humanity.
We have to embrace our differences, celebrate what makes us unique, see the value in everyone. Those are the values that should guide us, especially as we figure out how to use this technology.
Well said. And as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about. As genetic technology keeps getting better, the issues we've talked about are only going to get more complex. So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking the tough questions. The future, well, it depends on all of us.
That's right. And until next time, everyone, keep diving deep.